Hello, America, and welcome to Of the People. My name is Robert Chernin with the American Center for Education and Knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us for yet another podcast. At ACEK, we believe America is exceptional precisely because of our individual freedoms and code of personal responsibility. Now, we're about a week away from the electors casting their votes in the presidential and vice presidential elections. But one thing we can say for certain, ACEK's values, our values, that America is exceptional, and the individual freedoms and personal responsibilities that underpin it have really won this election. If you look down ballot and you look at all the other elections, except the presidential election, which has yet to be decided, those values clearly swept most of the country. So we're pretty happy about that. The real question is, where do we go from here?
So one thing's for certain. The 2020 election is like none that this country has ever experienced. And the real question is, where do we go from here? Joining us again is Jay Shepard, Vice Chairman for the RNC, and our resident expert, Bruce Abramson, Ph.D., J.D., lots of other letters, and an expert on computers and fraud and data analysis. Guys, thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Of the People.
It's an honor and privilege to be involved.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Nice to have you guys. So, I want to start with something with really, let's put the presidential election on the sideline for a second. And my belief that if you go down ballot, our values, ACEK's values, really did carry the day. I know there was this talk about a blue wave, which did not materialize. Thank the Lord, right? But individual responsibility, the freedoms we enjoy, those really did seem to carry the day. Am I misreading that? I mean, Jay, what say you on that?
I think that's one of the things that we're spending so much time with the presidential election on is how did that happen that the president wasn't re-elected? When we look down ballot and see all the success for traditional Republican type values, we look at state legislatures where we've dominated and we've made gains, where if you look forward to redistricting, we're going to have a say in that. So you're looking at conservative values where people voted down ticket very strongly, picking up flipping 13 congressional seats and making a big difference even in California. These are major gains that are shifting, reflecting a shift in the electorate towards our traditional values as a party and as a nation. Where we're going is all in the right direction. And I think that's why it's hard sometimes to understand what happened in the presidential election, because the American electorate has really shown that it is going towards traditional values. The First Amendment, Second Amendment, all those places that make a difference day in and day out in people's lives.
And that makes sense. That's a good segue, though, Bruce, to the fraud aspect of all of this. There does seem to be a disconnect between all these down ballot results, which clearly, Jay, as you point out, do reflect a reaffirmation of American exceptionalism, personal responsibility, and the individual freedoms. So there is this disconnect, right, between down ballot and the presidential election. And Bruce, I know there's this discussion of all the mail-in ballots, chain of custody issues. Those are really retail, what we would call, right, retail electoral issues versus there's also this discussion of systemic issues. So you're the resident expert. Help us out here. Make it clear. So what's the difference between retail and systemic fraud that, again, not yet proven? I think there's an abundance of evidence out there now. Clearly, that's irrefutable, but that's obviously not a decision for us to make. That's a decision for the courts to make. But Bruce, help us out here.
Yeah. All right. So let's back up a bit. You're talking about the down ballot success. And I will say, and I want to do a little bit of reframing. I have been writing for quite a while. I've been saying that we are a country in the midst of a civil war. People don't recognize it as such because we're not shooting at each other, but we are in the midst of a civil war. There are two different views of realities, two different value sets out there. One of them likes the American Republican, wants to keep it going. The other, progressivism, wants to transform it into something different. The down ballot results show what I've been saying all along, which is that this election was not going to resolve the Civil War because neither side is going away after the election. We did well. We appear to have done well down ballot. But here's the thing. The problem with the mail-in ballots is not that they were fraudulent per se. It's that the structure of our election was a sham. Okay. This is true down ballot and it's true up ballot. Before the first ballot was cast, or at least before the first ballot was tallied or recorded, here is what we knew. There were 90 million ballots circulating freely around the country with no control over where they went for the space of several weeks. At least 65 million of those came back in and were counted. We don't know anything about those ballots. We know that there were very minimal efforts made towards what are known as verification and validation. That is, making sure that the ballots that came back before they were counted, in fact, reflected the non-coerced, unassisted, unaided view of a legitimately eligible voter. Okay, that was the structure of the election before anything was tallied. That structure has no credibility. It is not a free and fair election. It is performance art with 150 million.
So let me jump in though. But everything you're talking about really would be considered retail
No,
consideration
no.
So what I want to understand is what's the difference between systemic fraud and retail fraud?
Okay, you've got, all right. The first thing you have to look at before you get to, and I call them retail and wholesale, but before you get to those, you have to look at the structure of the election. The election was structured in a manner that has no credibility. None. I don't believe any of the results that came in from this election because and I've got a new article about this that's coming out today on Newsmax. Okay? The election was designed to lack integrity and lack credibility. There is an invitation to fraud every step of the way. Now,
right, so hold that thought.
Okay.
So Jay, in terms of, look, we've discussed this before, right? Free and fair elections are the foundation of this country, right? If your vote doesn't matter or your vote can be disenfranchised or stolen or not counted, then everything else that flows from that becomes illegitimate, right? And I know we're jumping around a little bit. So is there any discussion on the national level? And I know we're jumping ahead of even the presidential election for establishing ballot integrity or other issues to make sure that this future elections are free and fair, because that's really the issue, right?
Yes, one of the first things that's going to happen as soon as we reconvene at the national level is we're going to put together a permanent election integrity commission, and that'll consist of a tremendous number of lawyers that are going to look into each and every state, and it's really important to look at every state. Some of the places where the Republicans made gains in California and in New York are states where the presidential election was not in the balance, that they did not feel as though they had to be involved. And if you look at Pennsylvania, there were some races there where Republicans were ahead the same way the president was ahead, and then those changed. So there's a possibility that the ability to do election fraud happens in every single state, but there wasn't necessarily a focus on states like Vermont or in California or New York where we made gains. We really didn't make gains in those swing states down ticket. And I think that's because the potential for election fraud and what Bruce is saying about mail-in ballots, and I don't like to call them mail-in ballots because we've had an absentee ballot program that has worked. What we never have had is a vote out ballot system where people are receiving ballots just because they're on a voter checklist that may be accurate or may be totally fraudulent. But at a national level, we have to have a permanent commission on election integrity, and it has to be partisan on both parts, but it also has to be bipartisan. But you can't assume that it's bipartisan, that it's going to give you the correct answers, because they overlook things where they're more important for them to have an agreement than it is for them to actually have results that are right.
All right. And if the Democrats do retake the Senate after the Georgia race, I assume one of the first things they're going to do is give citizenship to 22 million illegal aliens, which will change the demographics of who votes anyway. But it was heartening. I can tell you that we actually won some races in California, which I found to be shocking to me.
Well, if they are fair and equitable elections, Republicans did very, very well. And I think one of the things we're seeing is a shift in demographics where those that flip seats were either women, minorities, or minority women in a couple of cases, especially in California, or veterans. So it's a coalition that we're building the base of the party around, bringing in more what you call non-tradition establishment Republicans that hold our values, but they may not look like old fat white men like me.
Or old bald guys like me. Exactly. So, Bruce, let's get back to this systemic fraud issue. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I think Jay makes a really good point of that the coalition going forward on the right of center, if you will, is going to look differently because through the populist movement that really Brexit and now Trump were harbingers of, it sort of recombined or rejiggered, if you will, the traditional coalition as we used to know it, certainly growing up. But I want to get back to this whole systemic fraud issue to make sure that we understand this, because my understanding is that, and this obviously goes about discusses Dominion voting service systems and the what I would call information war or computer war or cyber warfare issue. Because isn't that really systemic fraud versus, I mean, mail-in ballots to me are still part of what I would consider to be a retail.
Well,
not?
No, there are, but again, I mean, I believe that people continually focus on the wrong questions. The first thing you have to do, as I've said, is look at the structure of the election. This election was designed to invite fraud everywhere. Now, not every invitation was accepted. And as Jay has said, the people out there who wanted to commit fraud made their choices strategically, right? Just because I say that a process lacks integrity, okay? Some things do actually work on the honor system. If I put 1,000 ballots on a table in a shopping mall with a sign that said, please don't fill one out if you're not eligible, that doesn't mean that anybody would necessarily fill one out if they were ineligible, right? It's an invitation to fraud. It's not fraud. The people where the invitations were accepted were strategically designed. Now, retail fraud is the kind of thing that you get when you go chase specific instances. You say, here was this block of votes, for example. Okay. For example, we have a video that came out yesterday in the Georgia hearings that showed Republicans being chased out of a room, votes being recounted, a suitcase being taken out from under a table, and
actually 4 suitcases.
4 suitcases. Okay. Now, what we can do is we can say, well, okay, at the retail level, this behavior was fraudulent. So if we could tag every ballot that was tallied during that stretch, we could eliminate those ballots.
Okay,
right?
I got that.
Now the question is, what are the implications of that to anything broader? And this
wait, are we still on retail fraud? Or
we're still on retail. We're still
okay.
on. Okay. When you go from retail to wholesale, to get to wholesale fraud, you have to say that there was a problem sweeping through the entire system. Now, there are 2 ways to do that. Okay. There's the home run that everybody would hope for. Hey, look, I found a piece of computer code in place in 27 states that says when you enter a ballot that has Donald Trump marked, give him 0.8 votes. And when you have one that sees Joe Biden marked, give him 1.2 votes. Okay. If you can find that, yes, that would be a systemic fraud. But the more common part of systemic fraud or wholesale fraud that we're looking at is where you get enough instances of the retail to build a pattern, right? Think about what we just said with this Georgia problem. If it were possible to eliminate the votes that were tallied in that period, first of all, you got a problem, because we have every reason to believe that many of the votes tallied during that period were in fact legitimate votes. Mm-hmm. Right? So you're now throwing out legitimate votes because through no fault of the voter, they were tossed into a bin with garbage. Right? So that's a problem right there.
Right. And how do you separate the two?
Right. But at the retail level, we're talking about those specific votes. The wholesale level, what you have to say is, look, if I have one instance of that I can prove, we can eliminate those votes. Suppose I have 10, suppose I have 20. At what point do you say what we've demonstrated is a pattern, is a widespread pattern that requires us to vacate the election?
Got it. So hold that thought. So
Yeah.
Jay, I want to come back to you on this. I still want to stay with retail versus systemic fraud. What are you seeing? So if I understand Bruce's explanation, which is sometimes hard for me to keep up, I don't have that intellect, but if I understand it correctly, systemic fraud can also be sort of a coordination between the different states, even if it's a loose coordination that, let's call them the Midwestern Rust Belt states, or the states that really were targeted, obviously. What are you seeing? What are you hearing on all the state levels? Was there some sort of systemic pattern in place?
Well, I think we have to look at, what we call fraud. In almost every state, in almost every county, there are dead people voting. If it's one, if it's two, if it's three, it doesn't matter as much as the fact that it's allowed and it's not prosecuted. The reality is that we don't prosecute anybody for election fraud. We even have laws that talk about, well, you can't coordinate efforts between a PAC and a candidate. Well, it happens all the time, but nobody goes to jail for it. And they'll take certain cases and they'll say, all right, well, you did it, we know it, so we're going to fine the campaign $50,000 for it. That doesn't hurt anyone. The election result stays the same, even though it's influenced by fraud and illegal actions. So there's illegal actions being taken all over the place. And until we get to a point where we're saying, guess what? You disenfranchised one person, you disenfranchised us all. If you count an illegal ballot, you're not counting a legal one. That legal one doesn't have the impact of it. So until we get down to the point where we're saying, you do it once, you do it with one ballot, you go to jail. And it's a federal crime that's on the books, but we don't prosecute it. So in order for us to start making changes, we need to make sure every election is done and there's not one fraudulent vote. There's not one person playing games. And those people have to go to jail. And that's when you start seeing some real changes and it becoming a true law. Are you speeding if you're doing 80 and nobody picks you up? Yeah, you're still speeding. We need to prosecute people that are doing criminal acts. And you saw in that Georgia case with the 4 trunks, that's illegal. We see those people doing an illegal action. They need to be prosecuted and put the fear of God, and more so the fear of our government and the powers and the rules of law against those people, and put them in jail for those illegal actions that are causing not just election result changes, but the whole faith in the election process. And once we lose faith, then we become subject to the China influence and the Russia influence, where their goals were not for any particular candidate necessarily, but for us to lose faith in our government and lose faith in the rule of law and who is legally and illegally elected to office.
I completely agree.
That's a really good point. I think that, look, Bruce is the resident expert on this program. I'm the resident cynic. When you can sit before Congress and lie before Congress and not go to jail, then what's cheating in an election here or there? And I think the analogy to speeding is a pretty good one. That's true. So let's turn.
I agree with Jay's explanation. It was perfect. It was better than I could have said it. So kudos to that.
Well, much better than you expected coming from me.
but
Hey,
I disagree with your conclusion.
Jay, it's high praise from the resident expert. Just take it and say thank you. So,
I think it's important. That Americans understand that they should not have faith in this election. Okay. This is exactly what happened when I talk about, Jay said it brilliantly, but when I talk about structural fraud, here's the system. Hi, I've invented a system. Okay. I've invented a system for which cheating is easy. The stakes are high. The detection, the probability of getting caught are low. And if you do get caught, the penalties are slim. And by the way, you'll still be able to keep the desired goal you got if you cheated. Okay. This is the system. welcome to America's elections in 2020. Now, do I know that there will be cheating every time we play our game? No, I don't. But I have no faith in that game. And that is what I hope this comes down to. Okay. And this is the difference between retail and wholesale fraud. It's the remedy. Okay. The remedy to retail fraud is, yes, you have identified a block of votes that were mishandled and are suspect and therefore should be excluded from the tally. That's the remedy to retail fraud. The remedy to wholesale fraud is a declaration that you, the citizenry, have been defrauded. The people that you trusted to put in place a valid election mechanism failed. Whether it was incompetence or intent on their part, they failed. And the remedy to wholesale fraud is a declaration that what we had was theater, not an election, and it must be vacated. And that means at different levels that you do different things. If it were a congressional race, and we've seen this at the congressional level, we'll keep the seat vacant until we can schedule a special election. At the presidential level, that's not what happens when you vacate. What happens is it goes to the state legislatures and the House of Representatives to decide who the president is. But I think it's critical at this point, and this is why I have said, and I'm on the record of saying, if Joe Biden is inaugurated on January 20th, the American Republic has fallen. Because the only way that Biden can get inaugurated is for us to basically ratify the procedures that were used in this election. And if those procedures are ratified, we will never again have an election that anybody with any sense has any faith in. And what's more, after the election, and we've seen this because the Democrats have been proposing it, steps will be taken to ensure that they never fall from power. Okay.
Got it.
That's
That's a good segue. Sorry, hit my computer. That's a good segue. So let's talk about the Supreme Court, because obviously there are some court cases that are winding their way through Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all the battleground states, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, right? I mean, at some point, I think someone will pull in Pennsylvania. I think we lost Jay, and we got Jay back. Hi, Jay. It was sort of, you blinked out and came back. That was nice. It's quick. So this is going to go before the Supreme Court. They've already petitioned the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania. Obviously, certiorari takes 4 justices to agree to hear a case. But I guess the question is, if the Supreme Court agrees to hear any of these cases, and right now, a week or so out from the electors casting their votes, that's a very big if. On what grounds? I understand it would be a narrow, the Supreme Court always likes narrow cases or narrow rulings. But on what grounds constitutionally could they take up these cases? That's to you, Bruce.
Okay. Well, I mean, due process, equal protection, guarantee clause.
So hang on. So the guarantee clause, so Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government, right? So one of the claims would be that the elections being fraudulent rob the electorate or the citizens of a Republican form, representative form of government, correct?
Yeah, although it would probably be subtler than that. It's that what would rob us of a Republican form of government is the insistence that a fraudulent, staged, rigged election should be binding.
Okay. Understood. So the other thing that I've heard talk about, because I am certainly, while I'm familiar with the Constitution, I actually had civics class when I was in, grade school. But I'm not an expert, to be sure, is that there's the Equal Protection Clause, and that would be the 14th Amendment?
Well, there's one in the Fifth Amendment and there's one in the 14th Amendment. Okay. The reason we talk about the 14th Amendment is that the Fifth Amendment is applicable only to federal action, and the 14th Amendment is applicable to state action.
Got it. I do not think any state legislature will have the courage to take this on. They're going to kick the can into the legal system down the road and then hopefully to the Supreme Court. I do not see any state legislatures, even though there was this here when the hearing in Arizona and Rudy Giuliani was urging the legislatures that American freedom and American democracy was more important than their political careers. I don't see anybody putting their head on the chopping block. Jay, I want to go to you to sort of close this section out, which is because to me, you're always a man on the ground, meaning you talk to a lot of people, you sort of have a pulse for things. Assuming that Joe Biden gets inaugurated on January 20th and that this is not vacated in some form, and I would say we're a fair bit of ways away from that, what happens to the 74 million? I mean, what's your sense of it? What are you hearing? What's the pulse for the 74 to 80 million, depending on who's counting, that will feel that this election was not legitimate?
I think you're looking at two separate parts of the Republican Party. You're looking at those who were Donald Trump, brought in by Donald Trump, talked about draining the swamp, promises made, promises kept. And there are about 20 million in my estimation that are here because Donald Trump has brought them into the process. Those 20 million people, if they stay engaged, are going to make a major change in this country going forward. If we lose them because they lose faith in their impact being felt and making a difference, if they disappear again, then it's not good for this country. It hurts us in the 2022 elections. It loses our chance of taking over the House completely. We've got 21 Republican seats that we have to hold in the Senate. Those 20 million Donald Trump, drain the swamp, promises made, promises kept Republicans need to stay actively involved in the process. If they don't, we go back to the old days where it's a grind, it's trying to find the right candidate. But there's a movement out there that needs to continue to be developed, that Trump movement, that we need to feed. And we need to make sure they stay involved because they came into the process. They came in and made a difference. And they're going to feel as though they came in this time, they made a difference, and it was stolen from them.
Got it. So sort of like the Tea Party, will they stay involved and will they stay, when I say cohesive, not necessarily as a block unto themselves, but in terms of their values and participating in the process? That's what I'm hearing you say.
And I want to go back a little bit to what you're saying about the state legislatures and having the courage.
Sure.
Isn't the word I would use, but we need to understand that in those states, they're considered swing states.
Right.
And what gives the Democrats the advantage is because those are swing states and it takes a whole lot more courage to take a strong action because they're told that we need to be somewhat moderate. We need to be in the middle of the road and we can't make major changes. So those 20 million new Trump enthusiasts that are out there want people to be courageous. They want them to make bold action. They're tired of the old system. And that will hurt a lot of the legislatures in the swing districts if they don't take action, but I certainly don't expect them to.
Interesting. So, all right, gentlemen, as we close this out, first of all, I want to thank you for joining us. Let's have some predictions here.
I have a question for Jay on exactly this point. And that is that in 2016, there were a large number, I think maybe as many as 60 members of the Democratic caucus and the House of Representatives who boycotted the inauguration, claiming that they didn't think that Trump was a legitimate president. If Joe Biden is inaugurated, how many Republicans can we expect to do that?
It'll be less than 60.
Well, that's unfortunate because if you actually want to keep the people that Trump brought in, the party has to show that it stands with them. Mm-hmm. Okay. And there is, it may turn out that Joe Biden becomes the next president. Right. I mean, he's got lots of institutional support behind him, and there are lots of people who want to see that happen. But that doesn't mean that anybody has to agree that it's legitimate. Donald Trump, at some point may have to concede, but the concession can be of the form: we held an illegitimate election, and I can't, and I simply don't have the ability to prevent it from going forward. So I concede that I can't stop this, but it's still wrong. And I would hope that that's the speech that he gives. And I would hope that Republicans respond to that. But in fact, if the Republican Party basically says, okay, you win some, you lose some, we don't like the way that this one went, but we're back to business as usual, why in the world should all the people who wanted the swamp drained stay involved?
Well, I hear all the time. One of the things that I hear most often from some Republicans is, I don't like the Republicans in Washington.
Mhm.
And my response is, what Republicans are you talking about? Are you talking about Mitt Romney? Or are you talking about Donald Trump? Are you talking about Murkowski? Or are you talking about Ted Cruz? Or are you talking about the leadership of the RNC? You need to be more specific. It's not a cohesive group. Everyone has an agenda. Everyone has things that they want to accomplish and they feel defines Republicanism. So to get complete agreement on an issue of whether they're going to show up at the inauguration or not, or whether they're going to go to a Trump rally that same day somewhere, we're just not going to see it, because you can't define Republicanism as defined by a Republican leader, regardless of who it is and what's happening at the time.
Oh, here's what I'm looking for. Okay. I am looking for, I will back actively only Republicans who are prepared to say that this was an illegitimate election. And if Joe Biden assumes the presidency, he will certainly have the force of the presidency behind him. He'll have the authority, but he lacks legitimacy. That it was an unconstitutional coup. And, you can't prevent everything. That's what I'm looking for.
Well, you're hoping that that's the case. And I always hoped that I was a 6'9" power forward for the Celtics. Sometimes it's a little bit unreasonable to expect things that there's been no pattern that would lead to that.
Well, somebody will say that, and that's how I will know who to back. You are certainly right that it will not be the establishment, it will not be the majority, it will not be the official position of the party. But to the extent that there is a faction within the party that believes it and says it, that's my faction.
And it will be a large faction. The thing I would disagree with you on was your number, Jay, about 20 million of the Republican support were Trump supporters. I think it's much more than that.
Well, I think the 20 million are new people that have come in. I'm not counting someone like myself that's been in the Republican Party and been active, that is, loving what the president has accomplished in 4 years. So I'm part of that wave, but I'm not a new member of that wave.
I understand.
I am.
So let me. You're an old Democrat, right? I mean,
well,
you are the epitome of Winston Churchill, right? That says if you're not a liberal in your youth, you have no heart, and if you're not a conservative as you get older, you have no brains. Yes. Let me hold it at that.
All right.
Predictions. Will the Supreme Court take up any of these cases? Jay.
No.
Bruce.
The Supreme Court weighs in whether it takes up the case on the merits or not. I believe that they will take up case on the merits. Yes. But even refusing to hear the merits is a decision. Right?
Oh, I agree. I agree. I believe a really smart guy that wrote an article called them the last American institution standing. And yes, that's a plug for you, Bruce.
Thank you.
So my prediction is they will take up at least 2 cases and they will rule against Trump. They're not going to want to get into this. But they can't not take it up for the exact reason, Bruce, that you were talking about. Jay, Bruce, I want to thank you for taking time again to join us. This has been a really informative, enlightening conversation. I think we should do this again. I think the 3 of us do really well together, except that we're all old white guys.
It's always fun. No, I identify as young.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. We'll appreciate you joining Of the People. So where do we go from here? Actually, I think a better question is, where is here? To start with, here is about a week out from the Electoral College casting their votes for president, and I don't think anyone sees a path to changing the outcome of this election once the electors cast their vote. Is it possible? It's possible. We are in uncharted waters, but it's not probable. The next question is, will any of the court cases, once they are appealed to the Supreme Court, be heard? Remember, it takes 4 justices to agree to hear a case. In this instance, those 4 justices would likely be Justices Thomas, Gorsuch, Alito, and Barrett. But that doesn't guarantee they're going to take a case, and it certainly doesn't guarantee an outcome of the case. As my friend Dr. Bruce Abramson said in his recent article, the Supreme Court is the last real American institution standing, and whether they take a case or not, they're taking a position one way or the other. If they decide to hear a case, there's probably 2, maybe 3 constitutional principles that might be in play. The first is Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, which is the guarantee clause, and that guarantees American citizens a Republican form of government. The argument here would clearly be that being disenfranchised or having your votes nullified would therefore make it that you did not have a Republican form of government. The other would be the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, that different votes were treated differently based on the states. I think that's a more likely avenue. But we'll see what happens, and we'll see where we go from here. Remember, we are talking about free and fair elections and election integrity. And this isn't really just about this election. This is about making sure that we got it right for this election and for future elections. Because if we get this one wrong, then maybe Dr. Bruce is right. Maybe we no longer become our democracy, but we become more of an aristocracy. Let's hope not. Because in an aristocracy, or anything less than a Republican form of government, this is where the government tells you what to do, what you can do, what you can't do. Like the country should wear a mask for 100 days. There is also this discussion now about martial law. A little scary, never been there before either, other than in Lincoln's time, when he didn't necessarily declare martial law, but he suspended the Constitution, including habeas corpus, was later overruled by the Supreme Court, but what's done was done. The problem is I don't know anyone that sees how this ends well, and that's a concern for all of us as Americans. Because the only way this really ends well, if we capitulate and just accept the outcome, even if we don't believe that it was a fair outcome or that there wasn't something about it that was rigged, to coin a phrase. Folks, I want to thank you for listening to our latest podcast. At ACEK, we're not here to affect public policy. We're here to mobilize public opinion. We're here to educate, we're here to motivate, and we're here to try to connect all the red dots in the blue ponds. And if January 20th goes the way I think it's going to go, connecting all the red dots in the blue ponds is going to be more important than ever. And please don't forget, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram, tell your friends about us, sign up for our emails at ACEKFund, ACEKFUND.org. Leave us a review, hopefully 5-star. I think we deserve it. If we don't, tell us what you really think. We'll take any and all comments. I leave you with the following quote, as dark as it is. There was never a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. Let's hope we're not there yet. That was John Adams, by the way. Friends, I'm Robert Chernin. We are ACEK, and we are of the people. Thank you for listening.
Stop the fire.